Hello, everyone. Brad Hairston here. Welcome to Transform Now. My guest today is Kelly Monahan, the founder of the Upwork Research Institute, where she leads their Future of Work research program. Kelly is also an author. She's been featured on TED Talks. She has several degrees, including a PhD in organizational leadership. Kelly, I'm extremely happy to have you on. Welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks so much, Brad. No, it's a pleasure to be here. So, maybe to get a little bit more personal outside of the bio, I actually started my career in HR. And the reason was I grew up in Rochester, New York, and anyone who's familiar with Rochester probably remembers Kodak. And so I just saw, during my formative years is when Kodak shed 45,000 workers. And everyone thought it was due to the digital camera. But yes, in part, but they actually invented the digital camera, but didn't have the right culture and leadership and skilled labor to actually take advantage of that moment. And so I think unconsciously at a very young age, I saw how much work could be disrupted in someone's identity, in their personal life, and really become displaced because of technology. So I've spent my entire career, started off in HR, wanted to help engage leaders develop the workforce. And my very first project was reduction workforce. Learned very quickly all about the P&L and how, again, that was because of robotic process automation. And fast forward to where we are today, I've spent the last 12 years studying the intersection of AI in particular and the way it's intersecting with their labor markets today.
Awesome. Now, your name first hit my radar because of an interesting article that you wrote recently that was published in Wired magazine. And it was actually one that we discussed on our weekly Pulse Check podcast, where we talk about news items related to automation and AI. And my colleague and I were discussing it, and I remember thinking, wow, this is a really interesting article. We should try to get the author on the podcast. So here we are. I'm really happy to have you on. Can you just give us a little bit more context around how you came to be a future of work expert? I know that's probably not a title that even existed 5-10 years ago, but I'd love to hear just how that evolved.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So after I had done my stint in HR, and that's when I realized I think there needs to be a lot more data and research to tackle some of the problems that many CHROs are facing today. And after my PhD program, I got recruited from Deloitte, and they were starting their very first future of work kind of think tank within Deloitte. And the reason was this is about 2016 or so. Clients started to ask Deloitte, what is the future of work? And how should we be thinking about that? And so that's how my work really evolved. I had the opportunity to work with some really great researchers and partners at Deloitte. And we kind of came up with this framework where we thought about the future of work in three ways. Who's working and how that's changing. So from a demographic perspective, from a freelancer gig perspective, what the work is. Because of artificial intelligence. And again, this is back in 2016, before it was really agentic AI and these large language models. But we knew that algorithms in general were going to disrupt the knowledge workforce. So what people were working on was going to change. And then, again, before it was mainstream because of the pandemic, where people were working and trying to really understand how far apart, whether it was manufacturing or knowledge work, how far apart you could move the actual location of work and really begin to globalize the market. So that is when I started. That's been a helpful framework that I still used often today, to be honest with you, almost 10 years later, to really begin to understand what is actually different today, because everyone's talking about the future of work, but a lot of it's like evergreen issues that people have been tackling for the last 75 years. We just haven't quite figured out.
Yeah. Well, you spent much of your career researching the future of work, as you described. How has your perspective on AI's role in shaping workforces changed over that time frame?
Yeah. Well, Brad, I'm going to be honest with you. So I gave a TED Talk in 2019, and it was really about what humans need at work at the end of the day is what the core talk was about. But I was weaving in artificial intelligence, and I made this statement in 2019 that said, my nephew, who was five years old at the time, is much more intelligent than artificial intelligence. At the time, AI was really confined to a particular domain. It could not context switch. The examples that we often gave was the Netflix algorithm. The algorithm was really good on Netflix, useless anywhere else outside of that platform.
Right.
That has changed upside down. And I think that is probably where I'm humbled a bit as a researcher, is how quickly we've moved from that paradigm of confined algorithms into large language models and, really soon to be agentic AI that's now making decisions and executing on your behalf. So to me, it's a complete game changer. And if we're going to be honest, when I'm thinking about going back in 2016, 2017 at Deloitte, I think we thought was probably 20 years off, not necessarily 10.
Wow. One thing I wonder about is the next generation of workers, are they as mindful of the future of work and how things are changing as they need to be? Looks like there's still a lot of people going into accounting degrees and journalism and professions that some say won't even exist in 5 years, 10 years. So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I've done a lot of work right now, also researching and studying Gen Z in particular to try to understand. I mean, they just passed baby boomers last year in terms of their share within the workforce. So we have no more Gen Zers today than baby boomers in the workforce for the first time. I think there's two things going on. One is a paradigm shift of where Gen Z is placing work. So, if you go, this is actually Deloitte research, they recently found only 48% of Gen Zers think business is driving good in the world. Most actually think business is harming. And that's a big paradigm shift that we haven't seen before in generations. So as a result of that, we see them taking much less of their identity at work. They don't necessarily put that into the same primacy as even millennials or Gen X and baby boomers have in times past. So to me, there's a bit of a fundamental paradigm shift happening at the same time artificial intelligence is really beginning to disrupt knowledge work. At the same time, you have college and the price of education. Over the last 30 to 40 years, it has risen over 1,700% for the cost of education.
Yeah.
Price of a house is the same. And so this is the illusion now of the American dream is what Gen Z often calls it on TikTok, doesn't feel attainable. And so I think there's two choices that Gen Z has today. And I am concerned that there's still too many people repeating the playbook that we had 20 years ago, as if this is going to work. To your point, we need a certain amount of accountants, a certain amount of lawyers. I think that mix shift is going to be dramatically shifting of what we actually need in the labor markets. And what I'm really concerned about is that we have a skills gap and labor shortage in a lot of blue collar industries in the physical worlds that still requires labor. And we've overshifted to knowledge, white collar tech work, which is great. It fuels the economy, but now we've got a labor imbalance. And how do we begin to push Gen Z also into the trades and, make that, if you will, as sexy as the white collar professions? That to me, I think is the big paradox of Gen Z entering the workforce today.
Okay. You realize as you're talking about this, you're giving me parenting advice because I have a Gen Z child. I have a millennial, and I talk to both of them all the time about AI and the importance of skilling up and don't be impacted by the change, be part of the change, right? As the saying goes. I'm not sure I'm getting through to them completely, but who knows? Maybe I am.
Experience tends to be the best teacher, right? Unfortunately.
Let's talk about that article that you wrote recently that I really liked. It was titled 5 Things the C-Suite Keeps Getting Wrong About AI. And I'd like to just cover all 5 of those points because I thought they were all really good. The first one is AI is more about augmentation and automation. Now, your research behind this point showed that 58% of global leaders view AI as mainly an automation tool. What do you think is driving that perception among company leaders?
Yeah, I think the primary thing that's driving this is the need for efficiency today, and that AI development is happening in a very economic, uncertain world today. I mean, in many ways, when I talk with most business leaders, they haven't seen this sort of uncertainty in the economic and labor markets since 07, 08. And yet, everyone wants to capture AI. And so it's almost like this knee-jerk reaction is happening at the C-suite level of, well, this must be my cost-efficient play. This is where I'm going to drive efficiency. This is where I'm going to automate some labor out of work. But the reality is, and anyone who, has been studying how large language models work, outside of coding, it's not that great of an automation tool. It's really meant to augment and enhance. And it's great at learning and teaching and task iteration and working alongside of human intelligence. So I just worry the desire for efficiency has really clouded the judgment of what this moment is in terms of the development of large language models and where we're ultimately headed. I hope as, things go on, because the other thing I found in my research is C-suite is really frustrated. They're not getting the productivity and efficiency gains with AI.
Yeah.
But again, it's the wrong goal, wrong North Star, and we're using the wrong tool to accomplish that.
That's a great point. And certainly the World Economic Forum, their Future of Jobs report that came earlier this year supports your logic here. A lot of the research they came back with said, yeah, it's really about augmentation. It's not about automation or replacement. It's something that can be very powerful if used the right way.
Yeah.
The second thing that the C-suite keeps getting wrong, in your opinion, AI's managerial role is limited. Now, this one really surprised me. The idea that leaders have this expectation that AI will be coordinating projects, supervising people. So tell us more about how this surfaced in your research.
Yeah, I'm gonna tell you a real life story that happened to maybe help illustrate this point. So, I'm not sure the company name or anything, but I was with a large Fortune 500 organization a few months ago and was actually meeting with their CHRO and their HR organization, giving a keynote presentation. And, we got to this point of how hard middle management is for that company. And in particular, how much of an energy leak, if I'm going to be honest, with the HR people, and just this constant tension between middle managers trying to drive the work and coaching the people.
Right.
Because they had the player coach model. And so one of the people on the team said, hey, you know what? Is this where AI can actually help us out? Can AI just do this job? And it was a little bit in reaction. There was this research that come out last summer that showed 47% of Gen Z actually preferred ChatGPT as a manager coach than their human manager. So
Wow.
that was a reaction response. And, I was kind of driving the conversation of how could this be? What's happening here? That a chatbot has overtaken what people prefer in terms of coaching and learning than a human. And I think the CHRO said something really profound and just something that's somewhat controversial still,
Yeah.
which is middle management is costing businesses and organization so much overhead, money. I was at Meta for a while. Mark Zuckerberg also was trying to figure out how do we cut some of that just bureaucracy that arises in large organizations. And, the CHRO said, I'm okay with this happening. If this is a good use case for AI, let's deploy it this way and have it act as middle managers. Now, why I disagree with that thinking and logic a bit is there's a couple reasons. We're underestimating the way that humans are actually wired to learn for long-term sustainable learning, and also the way that we as social beings tend to pick up implicit knowledge, as an example.
Right.
And so I think we miss some of that with ChatGPT only or any sort of large language model tool. That yes, can provide some good coaching, can provide some good feedback. But the reality is, I don't think this should be the primary use case. We should be using AI right off the bat. I'm seeing that a lot of how do we cut back on the middle management layer and instead use AI? And the last thing I'm going to say about this, the reason why I think it's flawed thinking is I think we're misusing the role of middle managers to begin with. Too often, anyone who's got an MBA, your MBA has taught you how to plan, direct, and control resources. That is exactly what AI is actually really good at. And it's not so good at the empathy, creative thinking, ethical judgment, the even at times context. And so I don't know, I actually hope we lean more into that human side of middle management. And then the question is, do a lot of these people still want to be middle managers? And that's what the job becomes more and more.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, the next point has a connection to this to some degree. The third item in your article is AI's impact on work is about tasks, not titles. So here you talk about how you unpack roles to isolate the tasks that are right for AI. And that's really critical. Maybe that's a step that some companies are not doing. So could you just elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I'm at Upwork, and Upwork is a freelancer platform that we match freelancers and obviously clients with projects. So we're a task-based, project-based inherent labor market. And so it was interesting. What I began to see is that as ChatGPT came onto the scene more mainstream in November 2022, we saw certain tasks and areas on our platform become disrupted, but not the whole thing. And, I did a lot of interviews at the time, and even interviewing freelancers, they had said, hey, you know what? AI can do about maybe 25% of this task or 50% of this particular part of it, but
Hmm.
there's still X, Y, Z that's actually the bundle of the work that I deliver.
Right.
And in a full-time employee model, that is multiplied by 10 in terms of the bundle of tasks that are being done. And so what I worry about, and this is just symptomatic of how economists and labor economists think about technology, is we always come from it from a substitution effect of
Hmm.
I have this new technology. How many people can I take out of the work, essentially, or how many roles can I take out of this? And what I'm concerned about is this isn't necessarily robotic process automation, where maybe that substitution made sense in
Hmm.
back offices. Instead, this is more of a general purpose technology. And as a result, it does not have a one size fits all. I'm not seeing easily identifiable substitution effects at an
Hmm.
actual role level. And I just worry just by the way that we have thought about technology for the last 20 years, we're still trying to find that substitution. And again, just like automation, this is not the right use case for these particular technologies today.
Totally agree with that. And I totally agree with your next point. AI adoption rates are not as high as the hype suggests. So, Kelly,
Yeah.
what do you think are the biggest barriers holding companies back from fully integrating AI into their operations?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, based on some of the dialogue we've just had, I think leaders are looking for the wrong use case. And so
Hmm.
as a result of that, AI is a very big investment. This is not a free technology. This requires, especially if any sort of company is going to, one, build any of their own foundational frontier models. That's extremely expensive. I think we'll only see a few of those arise. But then any sort of applications they're building on that and fine tuning and applying that within their own organization, I
Hmm.
continue to see cost being a big barrier in terms of actually enterprise-wide adoption. The second thing that I see in our research from leaders tell us is skilling. And so they don't have the skilling programs in place to actually utilize the benefits of AI. In
Right.
fact, our latest research shows about only 1 in 4 organizations today actually have a formal AI learning program in place, which floors me a bit because everyone I think has, to some extent been given a license or, playing around with it. But again, it's really beginning to formalize and build that foundation of learning and how we operate and use this at organizations, I still think is nascent. And then finally, it's still security concerns. So data privacy, security concerns, really trying to figure out how do we make sure that all of our IP doesn't start going into these models that then are being trained and can be leaked out in the mainstream use. So I think those are the three things. It's cost, it's skilling, and it's data privacy that we still have to really figure out.
Hmm. And final point from your article, which
Okay.
relates to that, is around AI literacy. So you found that overall there's a need for greater AI literacy at all levels. And there was a really interesting point you made in the article that your research suggests that AI is not being used as much by highly specialized professionals. I mean, that's kind of the assumption, right? In every company, you think, oh, there's a data scientist or there's an engineer. They're probably using AI, all the time. And yet you find out they're not. So
Yep.
talk about that, if you would.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting, again, like maybe paradox, I would say, that's happening right now with this wave of AI adoption. And the reason why the highest specialized individuals in our workforce today, so again, a lot of that's going to be lawyers, engineers, doctors, as you mentioned. One is a lot of them are in highly regulated industries.
Mhm.
And so regulation has not been a friend, obviously, to AI adoption and usage. And so right off the bat, that's been difficult for them to adopt. But I think what's even more interesting and something to consider is that in a lot of the field experiments studies, what we've seen is right now, large language models are really helping less skilled and less experienced people catch up and is not having the same sort of benefits for highly skilled individuals. It's almost in some ways a large language model is meeting the highly skilled individual where they are and not necessarily amplifying or having those productivity gains that we're seeing in the lower end of the workforce, either based on lack of skills or experience. And so I think that's something it's going to be interesting for companies and leaders to think how to solve for, to get really specialized talent to adopt at faster rates. I also know working with both at Meta and Upwork with our AI engineers, they also have such a high bar of what they expect these tools to do. And I don't think many people who are really specialized in this field actually think the current large language models are delivering something as beneficial as it could. And so I think you're seeing a little bit of that slower adoption too for people who know how good this can be and should be and are kind of waiting for that next iteration to come out before adopting this and embracing this at full steam.
Interesting. I saw a news headline yesterday about the US president, I think, signing an order that all school children need to learn AI or something. I haven't read it, so I don't know the full extent of it. You think that's going to help if we start educating kids in grade school about AI and both the benefits, but also the dangers of it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's funny. So my nephew's now 11, and him and I go back and forth a lot on, ChatGPT together. And, it's fascinating to see what children, they so inherently and organically come to this as, again, that augmentation tool, that play tool, that creativity. That to me is really, we almost as adults need to be adopting more of that childlike mindset that I think a lot of these children just have when they see new technology. There's no fear. Oh, this is cool. What can I do with it? So I think the earlier that we can, as a society, really get this technology into the hands of, and from an educational perspective, into the hands of children, with a huge caveat that we have got to understand the ethical implications of this. And I think the one thing, again, working at Meta and Facebook for a while, is we know that technology, when introduced to young children, does begin to rewire the neural pathways of how people think and develop. And so this artificial intelligence, I do think, will change the way that we learn, acquire knowledge, the way that we likely interact with each other. And I think there needs to be a lot of guardrails as we think through of what needs to continue to be true as human beings in a healthy, functioning society. And how do we instill that at a very young age so that this general use technology grows up with good intent in our youngest generation and it doesn't go awry, because it's still so new and there's still so much we don't know of some of the longer term consequences. So, but also we can't be fearful of it. It's coming. And if we don't embrace this at young, ages, we are likely to, really be surpassed by other economies who may be embracing this technology at faster rates.
Very true. Kelly, I love the way you ended the article, and I'm going to quote you here.
Okay.
Remember that the best managers will always be the ones capable of empathy, strategic vision, and nuanced communication, traits that AI, for now, can only tangentially support. Shifting from a mindset of AI versus people to AI with people is not just a semantic difference, it's the key to unlocking AI's full potential for sustainable growth and innovation in the modern enterprise. I think that hits upon such an important point that often gets lost, which is, there's so much focus on AI replacing jobs and disrupting careers that people have worked their entire lives to develop. And people don't think about the fact that AI and automation ultimately have a goal of elevating humans and giving us work that's more fulfilling, that's more inspiring, that's more engaging, because it's calling on our intrinsically human qualities. And we're not spending as much time on the busy work and the mindless stuff. So I love the point, and I thought it was a beautiful way to end that.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for that, Brad. So the one thing that evokes, I had an opportunity to go to South by Southwest this year, and I was on a panel with Lucas, who leads the research over at Slack. And I think what was alarming to me, what they found, is that when AI was, being used, and people on average across knowledge work were being freed up about 24 to 25% of their time was now freed up. What they chose to do with it. And the number one thing people chose to do was more busy work. Is I think about, how do we get to this ultimate reality that I think we all want to live in, which is this augmented way of working, which is where humans are doing exactly what you just said, intrinsically the human work that we know we're wired for. But the reality is we've taken so much of the human out of the workforce for the last 20 or 30 years. Again, in favor of efficiency, of reliability, scalability, repeatability. We wanted really a process. And we've done a phenomenal job at that. But now we're asking people, I need you to be creative. I need you to be innovative. I need you to figure out how to use your free time. But we've micromanaged for the last 30 years. We haven't given people free time in the workforce. And so to me, I think this is the great crossroads we're at for managers and leadership today. And actually released a book earlier this year called Essential that really begins to unpack this from a leadership perspective. We desperately need to bring human intelligence back to the forefront of how we wire work, how we think about work, how we value work. And we've taken unintentionally a lot of that out, but now we're really required to put that back in. So how do we make sure as people have free time because of AI, they don't go back to busy work, more of the same, but we actually are beginning to drive greater value, creativity, and innovation. I think it's gonna be a new muscle for many people to learn, to be quite frank.
Beautiful. Love it. Kelly, you have written a book that was recently, you co-written a book that was recently published. You mentioned the full title is Essential: How Distributed Teams, Generative AI, and Global Shifts Are Creating a New Human-Powered Leadership. Perhaps you could give us a little teaser on the book here as we wrap up today.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, I started my career in HR, and I was floored at how little data that was being surfaced or used to make decisions. Like, if you think about it, like if there's going to be a long-term consequence decision, it's what you're doing with your talent, that impacts not just your organization, but the way that they're obviously showing up within their communities. And, I really committed my career to trying to surface the people level insights that were required just to help balance the P&L data, the, IT data with something else. And that's essentially what Christy and I do in Essential, is begin to build the economic database case for why we need to start bringing people and human intelligence back to the forefront of work. And really, it's the roadmap for how to do that. What are the 4 things people need in order to actually feel intelligent in the workplace? We begin to unpack that. And again, not in a way that feels soft or fluff or like a self-help book, but truly, this is what the research says. This is really the scientific evidence that we've seen how the best performing organizations are operating today. Here's what they're focused on. So that's a bit of a teaser for the book. I think if your audience is looking for, hey, managing people is hard, and it's never been harder. Leading an organization today and making these decisions have never been harder. What is a manual, or how do I rethink some of these assumptions I might have about people at work? I would say the book for them.
Fantastic. I'll definitely have to give that a read here soon.
Awesome.
So thanks for that. Well, Kelly, it's been a true privilege having you on. Your perspective on the future of work and where things are going, and how leaders today have to take a different approach to the way that they manage their teams and even hire people as well. Everything's changing on requirements for roles, and new roles are emerging as well that are factored into this. So it's a dynamic and continually shifting environment out there, and you're certainly right on top of it. So thanks for being on and sharing your thoughts. Really, really appreciate it, and I wish you the very best.
Thanks so much, Brad. I really appreciate it as well.